Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and the word used to describe people who support a Jewish homeland, Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael is Zionist. A Zionist is someone who is passionate about the rebirth of the sovereign Jewish state of Israel and who celebrates both the creation of Israel and the viable future of the Jewish state. But Zionists are not monolithic. There are secular Zionists, religious Zionists, nationalist Zionists. Zionists on the right of the Israeli political spectrum, on the left of the Israeli political spectrum. And from the earliest days of the Zionist movement, when Theodor Herzl helped realize the prophetic call of people like Leon Pinsker, who was writing about a Jewish return to Palestine more than 10 years before Theodor Herzl ever thought of a sovereign Jewish homeland. From the earliest days of the Zionist movement, there have been heated battles over the direction that the Zionist movement should move in. There were schools of Zionist philosophy, from the great Jewish writer and thinker Ahad Ha'am, who championed what he called cultural Zionism, to Rabbi Hillel Kook, the first chief Ashkenazi rabbi in pre-state Palestine, who championed religious Zionism, to Zev Jabotinsky, who believed that the Jewish people would only be able to reestablish a sovereign state of their own if they were willing to take up arms in defense of the Jewish right to biblical Eretz Yisrael. And the ideological battles within the Zionist framework continue to this day as contemporary Jews see and understand and define a Jewish state in different ways and through various Zionist lenses. One organization dedicated to Zionism is the American Zionist Movement, also known as AZM, which defines itself as a sort of umbrella organization representing a broad array of Zionist perspectives and devoted to educating people about the state of Israel and advocating on behalf of Israel and on behalf of the Jewish people as a whole. And for some 4 decades, the American Zionist movement was led by a highly regarded executive director, Karen Rubenstein, who retired in March of 2017 and handed the reins over to a man with the most impressive background in service to the Jewish people, Herb Block, who for more than 15 years served as Assistant Executive Vice President of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, which is the world's leading Jewish humanitarian organization. And Herb, it is a pleasure for me to have you at this table, to meet with you in person. Thank you for joining us on L'Chaim.
Thank you for having me here.
There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I want to begin with you first, just for a moment. How did you get to be who you are, and from where was your Jewish commitment grow? Tell us first about where you grew up and who your mother and father were, and what kind of Jewish home you grew up in.
So I grew up in Manhattan.
Where?
First in Greenwich Village, and then in the Gramercy Park neighborhood. My father, the late Rabbi Irving J. Block, was the founder and a rabbi for 40 years, from 1954 to 1994, of the Brotherhood Synagogue.
A very distinguished synagogue.
Which is still located on Gramercy Park. My mother grew up in the Bronx, and
Her
then
name?
Phyllis Rabinov Block. She lived then on the Upper West Side. My father was originally from Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I understand you have some roots as well, grew up in a very strong Jewish and Zionist household. My father's family were Litvaks from different shtetl in Lithuania who came here at the turn of the 20th century. My mother's family also, well, my grandmother was, I'm 3/4 of Litvak. My mother's family was from, her mother was from Odessa and escaped the pogrom in 1904 to come to America. The rest of the family was from Volozhin, descendant of Chaim of Volozhin, and then lived in Smorgon in what's now Belarus, grew up in a very committed Jewish household. I went to school for 12 years at Ramaz, the modern Orthodox day school on the Upper East Side, and then to Columbia College on Morningside Heights. So I spent a lot of years growing up in Manhattan.
Absolutely. You're a Ramaz kid.
Yes.
So you were part of a modern Orthodox family?
Well, my father, my father had an interesting religious background. I mean, he grew up in an Orthodox Talmud Torah and community in Bridgeport. Went off to World War II in the middle of college, and went back to UConn and graduated.
Where did he go?
He was in the Pacific.
As a soldier?
It was in the U.S. Army, but he ended up in Army finance. He was willing to fight, but he was a Jewish.
But this is before he became a rabbi.
Before he became a rabbi, he was in the middle of college. He enlisted. He was studying accounting. Wasn't thinking about being a rabbi. His father was a house painter, and they saw an accounting background that they sent him to Army finance.
Okay.
And then he went back to college, and then he grew up in a passionate Zionist household in Bridgeport, and went off in '47 in Machal to Palestine.
Wow.
And was at Hebrew University and was also in the Machal and Haggadah. His mother became ill, and he ended up coming back to the States in '48. One of his great moments of his life was being outside the Jewish Agency building in Yerushalayim on Kaftep in November, hearing the broadcast that Motzei Shabbat of the anniversary we just celebrated, the 70 years of the partition vote. He came back here, worked for a Jewish fraternity, met Rabbi Stephen Wise, started to study at the Jewish Institute of Religion, then merged into Hebrew Union College and graduated from HUC JAR, and had his vision of a synagogue without labels.
Yes.
And that worked ecumenically, and started the Brotherhood Synagogue in '54.
Which is not known as an Orthodox synagogue, is
Correct.
it?
No, it's an independent congregation. My father, it was for a time a member of the United Synagogue. It's basically, it functions more or less like a conservative synagogue. The rabbis and clergy have, since my father to this day, have come from the cantors from the JTS.
Okay.
But it's not a member of any movement. But it was an independent congregation. He grew up, as putting on talis and tefillin, and said he considered himself an observant rabbi in a synagogue that was in many ways conservative, but many of the members were Reform.
I follow.
And so it was an eclectic congregation. But I went to a modern Orthodox school and would sort of.
Okay, but when you attended your father's synagogue, you were exposed to this eclectic view of Judaism that represents who your father was. Your father was an unusual rabbi. There are very few rabbis who had the spectrum of experience and perspective that your father had. And do you have siblings?
No.
Okay.
Only child.
So, first, was it hard to be the son of a rabbi and a distinguished rabbi? Was that ever hard for you? And number two, did you ever think of becoming a rabbi yourself?
Growing up, many people would ask me if I would be a rabbi. I think when I was 3, I would tell people I wanted to be a garbage man because that seemed like a cool job. I did not consider becoming a rabbi myself. I entered, and we'll talk about a career in public service. In many ways, my father was a public servant in his own right as a rabbi, a community servant. But the synagogue was diverse in terms of its spectrum of Judaism. My father also was very committed to a broad spectrum of relationships, including with Christian clergy, and was very involved in many ecumenical groups. Had a long-standing relationship with the Black Jewish community in New York back to the days of the 1950s, and Rabbi Wentworth Matthew and the Black community, and with the Ethiopian Jewish community in the early days before there was a well-known Falasha community, as it was called in those days. So I grew up with a very diverse background,
also an
inclusive background. After my father passed away, I found some letters that I had never seen before, where he wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, telling him what a devotee he was of the Rebbe, and asking for a bracha when I was born. And we used to sit and watch the Farbrengens on cable TV. So my father had a very eclectic and diverse background, which I think helped shape me as a person who.
I'm sure it did. You did not say it was hard being the son of a rabbi.
So it was hard in the sense of you're kind of always on when you're as a what people call a PK, a preacher's kid. So when you go to shul, everyone's looking at you, and you're davening what you're doing and all that, and you always have to be there and be on. And but
did you ever resent it?
Not really. And I enjoyed going to shul, being there at the beginning with my father, and I was the Baal Koreh for a while and all that. So I enjoyed it.
Well, you have wonderful yichus. You come from a line now of families that really made a major contribution. And you have said now a number of times, your household was Zionist. Your mother and father were very much committed to and involved with Israel, correct?
Right. My father was, as I told you, he spent that year in 47, 48.
Yes.
His sermons always tied into the land of Israel. He was passionate about the land of Israel and its importance. He is buried in Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, which was his final wish to go back to the land that he loved so much.
That is fabulous. And one more thing about you. You worked for the JDC, known as the Joint. And in my introduction, I made a passing remark. It is known as one of the great humanitarian initiatives in the Jewish community. I'm sort of impressed that you spent so much time there. And I feel it was again, if somebody works for the Joint, they're doing some real good for the Jewish world. Do you feel I'm being accurate or I'm being over-romantic?
No, the Joint Distribution Committee is an amazing organization. I was privileged to be there for about 15 years. It was, it's founded in 1914. I was just telling someone the story the other day. They asked me what was the name of the Joint Distribution Committee, or how did it get that name? And it was really there were 3 streams of the American Jewish community in the time of World War I that were approached by then Henry Morgenthau, who was who had reached out to Warburg and Schiff and others in America.
Great philanthropists.
Great philanthropists to help the suffering Jews in Europe and Ottoman Palestine. And they raised money through the Jewish trade union movement, through the secular and more German Jewish community crowd of the American Jewish Committee, and through the Orthodox crowd of the Jewish community of the Agudath Israel. And the 3 groups raised money in their own segment of the community and pooled it together to form a joint distribution committee to distribute the aid to Jews in Europe, regardless of who they were and their background.
Yes, I fear it is not as well known today as it was in my parents' generation, even when I was younger myself, and that there is less of an appreciation for the ethic of the JDC and what it did and what it continues to do. And I just want to hear whether you're concerned about how the JDC is embraced today in the Jewish community, and whether you feel it still has a vibrant future.
When I came to the JDC, many people said either they knew the organization and it was the greatest Jewish humanitarian agency around, or they never heard of it.
Yes.
And it was, in many ways, proud to be the best kept secret in the Jewish world. And I came there in '99 after a career in government, and many people didn't, if they hadn't heard of it and they were not in the Jewish world, they thought it was, the Joint Distribution Committee was giving out joints. So it was a name that people, wouldn't quite understand what it meant. But those who knew the organization and had experiences, or many American Jews were helped by the Joint to come to America from Europe and in the period of the Holocaust, or had family that was helped by the Joint in Europe, and it was and remains a beloved organization. Does an amazing work around the world. For many decades, most of the funding of the JDC, or the Joint, is known both ways, came from the Jewish Federation system. The JDC also couldn't really talk about a lot of what it was doing quietly behind the Iron Curtain, and in many countries around the world where they couldn't advertise what it was doing to help Jews in need. So the system worked well. It got its funding and didn't have to talk about what it was doing. As the Jewish philanthropic world and the Federation system has changed in the last 20 years, JDC has begun to do a lot more to make American Jews aware of the organization, and its funding is no longer primarily from the Federation system, but from many other donors and foundations and Jewish partners. So it remains an important piece of what the JDC, how the American Jewish community helps its brethren around the world.
Yes. Well, anyway, I hope people who may not be familiar with it are more familiar with it now, and I appreciate your sort of giving us an overview. All right, so now I want to talk about you and the AZM, American Zionist Movement. You know, Herb, there are people who know about World Zionist Organization. There are many people now who are familiar with the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, led by Mort Klein. And there's it has become a controversial organization in the Jewish community. People know less the letters AZM and the American Zionist Movement. In as brief a moment as possible, what is AZM? And the more interesting question for me that I want you to tackle is, where is AZM on the political spectrum inside the Jewish community? ZOA tends to be seen on the right. There are those who feel it's on the far right. If you talk to Mort Klein, he will tell you he's a centrist and he's misunderstood. But the typical perspective is, oh, ZOA, they're crazy right people. And in some way, Herb, and you've seen this in your lifetime, there's been an evolution in the way people relate to the word Zionist. At one point, it was a noble word, a word of idealism. And then somewhere along the line in recent times, Herb, the word Zionist is associated with a particularism that is exclusionary. The whole Zionist enterprise now is being attacked viciously by those on the far left. So I want you to take a moment, talk about who AZM is, and then place AZM for us in the Jewish world today.
How many hours do we have? So the American Zionist, let me give you a little bit of the short synopsis and then a little bit of history and try to relate those questions. The American Zionist Movement is a coalition of 25 national Jewish Zionist organizations.
For example?
We're comprised, the American Zionist Movement is comprised of 25 national Jewish Zionist organizations across a broad spectrum of political and Zionist and religious perspectives.
Ideologies, yes.
And ideologies, and we work together to, as the American affiliate of the World Zionist Organization.
Give me some examples of your participating organizations.
Our organizations, and let me break them in different categories. We have advocacy organizations ranging from the ZOA, and I won't say on the right, as Mort will tell you, as you said, But from ZOA to Amenu, which is the old Labor Zionist Alliance,
which
to
normally is considered to be on the left.
to even further on the left, let's say, Partners for Progressive Israel, which is what used to be known as Meretz USA. So that's one level of organizations. We have women's organizations: Hadassah, Amit, Emunah, Naamat, the old Pioneer Women. We have organizations on the religious spectrum. The Religious Zionists of America used to be known as Mizrahi, Merkaz USA, the Zionist arm of the conservative movement, ARTZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. We have organizations including B'nai Zion and B'nai B'rith, which are Zionist organizations and work in both humanitarian areas and advocacy as well. We have youth movements, including Habonim Dror, Hashomer Tzir, B'nai Akiva, USY, BBYO, NIFTY. So there's a diverse group of organizations of different types of Zionist organizations that identify as Zionist groups, and from a different religious perspective, different ideologies, and different political perspectives.
So you heard me use the word umbrella organization. And then you've described very differing organizations under your umbrella. What do you do for them?
So in America, there has been a coalition umbrella organization such as the AZM for many decades to unite the Zionist groups in America, where there's a common representation of the American Zionist in the World Zionist Organization, and to try to bring together disparate voices where possible for a united support of Israel and Zionism.
I am skeptical.
Let me give you some of the history, and maybe when the organization was formed, there was a less polarized time. You mentioned Theodor Herzl and the World Zionist Organization. The first Zionist Congress was 1897. We just marked the 120th anniversary. There were American representation there. Shortly thereafter, there was an umbrella groups like the Federation of American Zionists, which had chapters, which eventually became the ZOA later on. They came together to form the American, this is really the AZM's origins back to 1939 in a more formal way, the American Zionist Emergency Council, to begin to push for the creation of the Jewish homeland. That organization went through a couple of name changes in the next decade, and it became known as the American Zionist Council. In 1949, the word emergency was dropped after the State of Israel was formed. And even though the State of Israel was born, the notion of Zionism was obviously to fight for the rights of the Jewish people.
Okay, so how do you serve ZOA?
So we have groups of diverse size and diverse opinions. We try to provide a platform for the organizations to sit together to share resources on Zionism. We're trying, you mentioned the Zionist, the Z word, you may have referred to it as, or others have referred to it, the Z word or the Zionist word is not in as much use as it was. And when I grew up and my grandparents and others, people talked about a Zionist household. The word Zionism is either not used or it's used in a negative way.
Because, wait, take one moment. Why is that? What happened to the nobility of the concept of Zionism? And at one point, no one was reluctant to call themselves a Zionist. It's not true any longer. Why?
I think in many ways it probably goes back to the Zionism as racism effort at the UN, and a time when the enemies of Israel, the enemies of Zionism, managed to capture the word and associate it in a negative connotation. There are many national movements, there are many movements of liberation, there are many movements around the world of different peoples to have their homeland and be proud in who they are and have a sovereign place for their ethnic, religious community. And Zionism should be cherished and a model for that. We highlighted some quotes of Dr. King about Zionism and the State of Israel last week on around his birthday. So the term Zion and Sion in Hebrew is a core part of who the Jewish people are. I mean, when you the prayers, the tefillot, the davening, the Torah is full of references to Zion. It's a core part of who we are. Over the years, and maybe the origins are unfortunately to the time of the UN. The American Jewish community has moved to talk more about Israel and being pro-Israel, and the word Zionism fell out of favor, or was taken over to be used by people who are against the Jewish state, or in many ways became a code word, not a code word or a more polite term to be anti-Semitic. Well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. I'm not really against the Jewish people, I'm just against the Jewish state, but I don't want to say something that's more anti-Semitic, so I'm anti-Zionist, but I'm not anti-Jewish, which we don't think is any kind of distinction that one can make, and there's plenty of evidence that most anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, as the president of France notably commented on a few months ago. So we're going to be trying to, under a platform of Zionism Forward, trying to explain to people now, 70 years after the creation of the State of Israel, why is Zionism relevant? That Zionism is not only about creation of the State of Israel and a movement that ended in 1948 when the State of Israel was founded, but it was envisioned to unite the Jewish people around the world and with all its diversity with the State of Israel and the Jewish homeland. And that's what Herzl and others envisioned Zionism to be, not just, okay, we'll close up the Zionist movement when the State of Israel was founded, but now that the State of Israel is founded, how do we connect Jews who live around the world with their homeland? It's interesting, many times you talk about diaspora communities, and I dealt with groups of diaspora communities when I was at JDC. The diaspora community of Polish Americans are people who came from Poland or emigrated here to America who lived in Poland before they came to America, for example. The Jewish diaspora are many people who've never set foot in Israel or have only visited, never lived in Israel, but the diaspora is connected because of thousands of years of history from the time of the Bible to the land of Israel. So it's our homeland for people who haven't lived there. And when there are people who question the existence of the State of Israel and whether it should remain as a Jewish democratic state, we have to unite Zionists of all stripes, whether they're on the right, the left, the center, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, unaffiliated, to support Zionism, which is the right of the Jewish people to their sovereign national homeland, and to connect people around the world with that. So that's what the AZM, the American Zionist Movement. The organization at times was a federation of the Zionist groups in America. Many do not know there remains the World Zionist Organization, which was founded by Theodor Herzl, which has the World Zionist Congress. And the first Zionist Congress was in Basel in August of 1897. That is sort of the elected parliament of the Jewish people. And hundreds of delegates from around the world get together every 4 or 5 years in Jerusalem. In the interim, there's a smaller group of that Congress, the Zionist General Council, the Vad HaPoel, which meets and brings Zionists from around the world to connect to Israel and represents Zionists from around the world in the Karen Kayemet, which is the Jewish National Fund, and in the Jewish Agency, which includes representation from Zionist organizations around the world. So we institutionally help coordinate and represent the American contingent in the Karen Kayemet, in the World Zionist Organization, in the Jewish Agency. So we have a representation role as well institutionally in those bodies, bringing American Jews to the WZO. And lastly, on the institutional role is, many of your viewers may know that there is a Zionist elections every 4 years related to the Zionist Congress. And tens of thousands of American Jews vote in those elections. They used to be held in paper ballots, now online. The next one will be in 2020, most likely. And that's a process by which American Jews in a democratic process can vote for delegates and representatives to go to the Zionist Congress in Israel and the American Zionist movement runs those elections
Uh-huh.
here in America, and the American contingent is the largest diaspora community represented in the WZO.
Okay. I would imagine then you don't believe the AZM stands anywhere specific in the political spectrum. That sort of question is irrelevant because you're trying to represent everybody.
Right. We are we do not have a specific platform.
Correct. You're more administrative than you are ideological.
We are ideological in our commitment to Israel and Zionism and uniting American Jews in support of Israel. We are administrative in the sense that we have a function within the WZO and with the Zionist elections, but our job in moving forward will not be only administrative. We want to try to reclaim the name of Zionism or rebrand Zionism, and it's a important, holy, significant historical term, as you started in the beginning, and as I mentioned, Zion and Zion is who we are as a Jewish people, and we want to try to explain to people what Zionism means, what it is a positive movement of liberation for the Jewish people to have a sovereign homeland, a nation state of in our ancestral land of Israel, and that people should support that regardless of where you are in the spectrum of ideologies or religion. And we want to work with all the groups in our diverse membership to help them with tools to explain Zionism in the community, on campuses, and in the media and in the public at large, both the Jewish and non-Jewish communities. And there are people who are proud to use the term in our organizations. There are Christian Zionists in America as well that we hope to be working with a broad spectrum.
There are organizations on the American Jewish scene today who have very different approaches to what it means to support the State of Israel. The Reform movement through ARTSA and other of its organs has one approach. ZOA has a very different approach. Young Israel has a very different approach. J Street has a very different approach. By the way, is J Street part of AZM?
J Street is not a member of AZM, nor is AIPAC, because they are political lobbying organizations that have not been traditionally in the Zionist organization structure.
Okay. There are people today, there are Jews today, well-meaning, committed Jews, who are very unhappy with Israeli policy. Very often it's related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But there's a feeling within the Jewish community that you get from some who feel Israel has in some way misused and continues to misuse its power. And that although the Palestinian community represents something in many ways that is reprehensible, there is still a feeling that Jews have that Israel hasn't taken enough responsibility for using its power in as just and as conciliatory way as possible. And there are Zionist organizations which are very critical of Israel, and there are American Jews who are very critical of Israel. And one of the things I really wanted to hear you talk about is, because you're in a unique perspective here, I wanted to hear how you analyze the anti-Zionist feeling that does exist now in certain parts of the American Jewish community, to the point that, Herb, there are some American Jews who believe that Israel was a mistake, that it may have been an outgrowth of something happening historically to the Jewish people, who were exiled and then who were kicked from pillar to post. Western country after Western country did not open the doors to the Jews and let them stay for any extended period of time. Theodor Herzl was motivated out of the fact that in France, the Jew, who was supposed to be emancipated by Napoleon in the first decade of the 19th century was still kept on the outside. That there were pogroms going on in Russia, that the Jew had no home, and therefore the Jew had to have a haven and a home of his own. Most people don't feel that reality any longer. And as a result, they feel that what the Jewish people did is come into a land that was already populated by an Arab demographic, and that Israel ultimately stole the land from another people, and to this day is not giving the indigenous Palestinian people enough of a national homeland of their own, and therefore they are critical of Israel, and they are loath to use the word Zionism. And to add to this, in contrast to your father, who was a rabbi, who was passionately pro-Israel, there are rabbis today who won't speak about Israel from their pulpit because they feel that if they do, those in their congregation who are critical of Israel will wind up turning on them. That's the scene at the moment. And now here comes Herb Block, who's going to be the executive director of the umbrella or Zionist Organization of America, AZM. I want to just hear you respond to what is seen as this Jewish landscape today.
The Jewish connection to Israel obviously has, and the American Jewish connection has evolved over years. There have been times when, thank goodness today we don't have a war, and there have been times when the Jewish community rallied around crises, whether it was wars against Israel, Soviet Jewry, and other crises of the world. So I think in part the crises of the past that united the Jewish community are in many ways, thankfully, not there in the same way today. The American Jewish community has always been, the world Jewish community has always been a diverse one. The Jewish people have been quarrelsome people since the time of the Bible. So it's not new for the Jewish community to be quarrelsome and diverse. Even in the early days of the Zionist movement in America, there were anti-Zionists. There were groups that were against the creation of a state of Israel because of issues of dual loyalty. Some prominent Jewish organizations in America were not, either were non-Zionists or were not on board. There are groups today in America, there may be groups on the left that are, or the far left that are anti-Zionist, but I think that's a minority. There are groups such as the Satmar in America, which are anti-Zionist for ideological reasons. A very strong Jewish community that doesn't believe in the creation of a Jewish state until the Messianic era. There's a very broad spectrum of people who define themselves as Zionists, believing in the Jewish state, who have very, very different viewpoints, as you said, about religious issues, where you worship, boundaries of the state, land, territories. There are people who want to call the land the West Bank, or occupied territories, or Judea and Samaria. There are many different terms that people use even to describe the same territory. I think it's important for people to understand that the Zionist movement goes back to a connection of the Jewish people to our ancestral time, to the times of the Bible. You can't travel anywhere in the land of Israel without experiencing the history of the people. So it's not just that, as some would say, Europeans came in the 1940s and took over a land. This is a land that the Jewish people have settled, have lived in, have had history, holiness, and connection to for thousands of years.
Do you understand that for those who are questioning Israel, the history you have just recounted, all of which is accurate, is irrelevant? Because what ultimately happened was the Jews were exiled. There's always been a remnant of Jews living in Eretz Israel, always, never broken.
Right.
At the same time, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, the majority of people who lived in the Ottoman Empire, in Palestine, were not Jews. In the 30s, the majority of people who lived in Israel, Palestine, were not Jews. In 1948, when Israel was established, the majority of people who were living in Palestine were not Jews. You and I appreciate the historic connection. That's not the issue. For those who are questioning Israel, for those who are standing in the Jewish community today, critical of Israel and Zionism, they're critical of, they would say, look, history evolves. And in at the end of the 19th century, we know the 20th century, there was an Arab population living in this land, and they don't see history. And not only do they see history, Herb, they don't see 20th century history. Well, the image is that the land is just populated everywhere with Arabs. That's not the case. So,
we've tried to do some things this year to, we called this the year of Zionist anniversaries, starting with last May and the anniversary of the Biltmore Conference in America through the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel, to give some of the contemporary history, including important international landmarks like the Balfour Declaration. We just had a conference in Washington and brought together a diverse group of people to celebrate 100 years of the Balfour Declaration. The UN partition vote. While we have a biblical and ancient connection to the land, there's also international legal doctrine and documents and processes that led to the establishment of the State of Israel.
I am a passionate Zionist. Right. I am outraged at the attacks against Israel and against Zionism. What I want you to address, however, is the criticism, because I believe it is a very subtle criticism, and I worry, I'm being honest here now, I worry that those who are inside the Zionist world don't understand where the criticism is coming from. The fact that you and I understand, by the way, it's not the United Nations partition plan that is the legal basis for Israel. The legal basis, the international legal basis for Israel, was established in the 1920s by the League of Nations and the Mandate System. Yep. The world said, we're going to create a whole series of states, one of which will be a Jewish state of Israel. That is the legal justification of Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan and Israel. And it's interesting to me, those who criticize Israel never say there shouldn't be a Syria or an Iraq or a Jordan. But that's a different issue. My concern is that there are people who argue that while the world did say in 48 at the United Nations, yes, there'll be a partition plan. The reason the Arab world didn't accept the partition plan was because they said, you're splitting up half of my land. Of course the Jew's going to accept it. It's not his land. If you don't have something and somebody says, here, take a piece, great. But if it's yours to begin with, the Arab says, why should I be happy giving up a piece? You're getting a piece. You're asking me to give up a piece. And that's the perspective at the moment that is fueling the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist position. And I want to know how AZM and those who are professionally involved in protecting, advancing Zionism, how do you answer those in the Jewish community who say to you, bottom line, in the 19th and the 20th century, the Jews were not the majority. They may have been there a long time ago, but by the time we get to the 20th century, they're a pittance of a minority. And they want sovereignty that impinges upon people who were living there. The Zionist movement has to address that.
So I think the history is important in the context of the people recognize in the Jewish community and elsewhere, knowing the history and the ancient connection to the land. So it's not just it's a return
I agree.
of the Jewish people to their land. It's not just coming into being plopped
Absolutely.
down in a land where there was no connection. And that
Absolutely.
connection, as you mentioned, the religious connection, the continual existence, the presence is critical to understanding why we are there and not in Uganda or other places where
Correct.
there have been talk.
Correct.
Also, the international legal system, starting with Balfour and the treaties and declarations of the 20s, is important so that it's not just a dispossession that people came in after the suffering in World War II.
Did we dispossess? Did the Jewish people dispossess?
I don't think so. The Jewish people came in to return to their land and live side by side, hopefully in peace. And they wanted to live in peace.
Was there enough room?
I think there would have been. And if you look at the maps, and it's really jarring to look at the maps for people to look at the maps of the partition plan in '47. The land that was envisioned to be the Jewish state is much smaller than what is there, much smaller than when people talk about the borders of '67. So the Jewish world and the Zionist world was accepting of this, of having a state in this land, of living side by side with their Arab neighbors in peace in a Jewish homeland that respected the rights of those that were there. And that is something that Israel is still it's a democratic country. There are Christians, there are Druze, there are Arabs, there's people of many faiths in the country who are citizens, who are in the Knesset, the parliament. So it's something that Israel strives for. I agree with you that the perceptions of Israel have become negative in many quarters. The analogies to apartheid are horrible and ludicrous. And anyone who knows the history of apartheid and the suffering would understand clearly that those kind of allegations against Israel are absurd. As in any country, people have their criticisms. There are American citizens who are patriotic and love America, who like President Obama, and there are people who didn't like him and like President Trump. And you can be a patriotic American and support the country, even if you have disagreements with the elected government of the time.
Two-state solution. I assume AZM itself does not take a position.
We do not have a formal position.
Correct.
Right.
Do you have a position?
I personally have always been believed, as from the time of my father and his roots, that we could hopefully live in peace, a Jewish state and an Arab state, what the boundaries are or how that's constructed.
Whose fault is it that there is no two-state solution?
I think ultimately, had the Arab world accepted the partition plan in '47, there would have been two states. There would have been the Jewish state and an Arab state. There were many other offers through the peace processes over the last decades, where Israel went out of its way to offer to accept plans that were offered, largely brokered by the American governments, to offer significant land. So Israel has made that commitment. I think even the current government is committed of Israel to a two-state solution, if that can be worked out with the Palestinian Arab community.
There is no two-state solution at the moment because the Palestinian leadership doesn't want there to be one. Is there anything more complicated about it than what I've just said?
There has to be a willingness to have a negotiation to end terror. You cannot have a negotiation with people who are trying to kill you. There are many people who of goodwill in the Palestinian community and the Arab community. But the elements that promote terror must be eradicated, because that cannot be that cannot be an acceptable means of dialogue. Including those who use terror or violence, even when it's occurred in much less in the Israeli population. But that's a very small element. But we cannot be driven as a Jewish people or in the region by the radical elements who rather than the majority of people who want to reach
Okay, and
a peaceful solution.
forgive me because I say this gently. The fact that you would mention Israeli violence is misleading. The difference is when there is Israeli violence, it is not institutional, and it is condemned. It is not part of the society.
I'm not
Palestinian,
I'm not
when the
mentioning that in any way
when
that
the Palestinians engage in
of course.
violence, it's
promoted.
It's promoted
Right.
and sanctioned,
and
then rewarded.
And when there's an element of violence, and this is something that needs to be known in the public, when there's any element, tiny element of violence from the Jewish or Israeli side, it is condemned, and it is an extreme position. As you state, the violence that occurs and the terrorism that occurs is promoted. There are streets that are named for Palestinian terrorists. There are textbooks that promote terrorism. There's a glory given to families. There are people who are paid to rewards by the government, as we've seen come out in the light in this Taylor Force act
by American attempt to stop
correct
funding Palestinian rewards for murderers of Jews.
But, so there's a culture of violence and terror that has taken over much of the Arab and Palestinian world. That's not to say that people will agree with every action that the government of Israel has taken, or every policy on land, or every policy on how Israel deals with Palestinians. And we have members, and there are American Zionists who are committed to Israel, who have very diverse views on, as I said, where the borders are, or how Israel should deal with the Palestinian population, with the Arab neighbors, etc. We would hope that we can contribute in some way to uniting people in support of the existence of the State of Israel when there's a lot of people who even question that. Maybe not the majority in the Jewish community, but there are many people outside, many people around the world who question why there should be a Jewish state. And that's something that Zionists who fought for the creation of the Jewish state must unite together to support.
Okay, last question. Pew just came out with a study of the way in which Democrats and Republicans view and support Israel. And Pew shows that the percentage of Democrats who now support Israel is significantly, dramatically lower than the percentage of Republicans who support Israel and Israeli policy. Are you worried for the bipartisan support of Israel, which has been at the cornerstone of not only American foreign policy, but has been on the cornerstone of the relationship that has been so wonderful between the United States and Israel? Speak for one moment about whether the erosion of democratic support for Israel because of its view of what Israel is doing unfairly to the Palestinian is something that keeps you up at night, or, Herb, do you not worry about it basically at all?
The bipartisan support of Israel has been critical in the America-Israel relationship.
Critically important.
Critically important, and has been and traditionally since the time when Truman recognized the State of Israel 11 minutes after its founding, there has been broad bipartisan support in America and in American institutions and political institutions, including Congress, for Israel. I think that remains in Congress and in the political system. That kind of broad support. I think that so much of American life in general has become politicized in what people see in TV and constant news on Twitter and Facebook and everything. So I think that unfortunately perceptions of Israel have suffered as a result of that, and I think that when at a time when you have American presidents have consistently been pro-Israel and supporting Israel and doing, there can be quarrels among the community of what that means, but have been very committed to the America-Israel partnership and relationship. So some of that may be just a factor of who's in the White House now, and if there was a different president, I suspect that those numbers would be different in many of those surveys. But I think at its core, and again, I just saw this study came out yesterday. I haven't seen how all the questions were phrased and everything. I think at its core, there is still broad bipartisan support for Israel and the America-Israel partnership and the strategic relationship among members of Congress in the House and Senate, among local government officials and others who will be our future leaders in the House and Senate. So I think that's there. It does concern me that some of the numbers that are reported have gone down, and I think that shows the need for a Zionist voice to speak up about why that relationship is important.
I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha. You're engaging in some important work. It's lovely to have you here at this table. I hope from time to time I can ask you to come here. We'll continue the discussion, and you have a huge job in front of you, but I believe that you're going to bring heart and mind that will help the Jewish people. It's been an honor to meet you. Thank you, Herb.
Thank you for having me on, and to hear someone who will go on and proclaim themselves a proud and committed Zionist is very important. I'm happy to be here and look forward to being back.
Thank you very much. The thoughts of Herb Block, who now serves as the Executive Director of AZM, the American Zionist Movement. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.